The floodlights of Wembley roared to life like a second sun, washing the stage in white brilliance. The air itself seemed to vibrate, a pulsing mix of screaming voices, stomping feet, and the relentless thrum of anticipation. 72,000 bodies packed into the stadium, swaying like one living organism. The banners, the lighters, the flags of a dozen nations. Everywhere you looked, the world had gathered to see one man. Freddie Mercury stood at the center of it all. Sweat glistened under the harsh beams. His sleeveless white tank top clinging to his skin as if it, too, was straining to keep up with the energy pouring out of him. His mic stand, cut down a half its size like a scepter, was clenched in his right hand. He looked untouchable, lean, radiant, a king bathed in his own spotlight. The band was already roaring through Somebody to Love. Brian May's guitar screamed in partnership with Roger Taylor's pounding drums, John Deacon's bass line anchoring the chaos. Freddie's voice soared above it, sharp, clear, commanding. Every syllable was a bullet of pure emotion, each phrase ricocheting off concrete walls and into the lungs of tens of thousands. And then it happened. The moment came on a high note, one of those signature Mercury crescendos that had, for years, seemed immune to human limits. His chest swelled, jaw opened, and his voice leapt into the rafters, until it didn't. A fissure split the sound. Instead of pure gold, the note cracked like thin glass. It wavered, buckled, and snapped off midair, leaving an ugly rip across the stadium soundscape. For the briefest flicker of a second, the world went silent. Roger's sticks faltered. Brian's fingers hesitated against the strings. Even the crowd, that great tidal wave of noise, stumbled into stillness. Did Freddie Mercury's voice just break? It was unthinkable. He had built his legend on control, on the impossible elasticity of that voice, a range that could outpace instruments and hold an audience hostage. He was fire, thunder, velvet, and steel until this second. Until now. Freddie's body froze. The mic trembled in his hand, a visible shiver that betrayed the iron facade he usually commanded. His eyes flicked, searching for an anchor. 1,000 camera flashes popped like lightning across the arena, catching him mid-stare, mid-panic. Immortalizing the one thing he'd sworn never to show, weakness. In the front rows, whispers ignited like sparks. "Did you hear that?" He cracked. A reporter in the press pit leaned forward, pen scrawling furiously. A fan covered her mouth with both hands. Another simply shook his head in disbelief, as though trying to rewrite reality in real time. Freddie's throat burned. He swallowed hard, as though he could swallow the failure back into his chest. The sweat on his temples was suddenly cold, his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to break free. Not now, he thought. Not tonight. This was supposed to be the show, the one carved into history. Wembley, the crown jewel. A flawless performance that would outlive him, one that no critic could ever touch. And yet here he stood, stripped bare by a single fractured note. He forced himself to keep singing, but the phantom of the crack haunted every breath. His mind replayed it again and again, louder than the drums, sharper than Brian's guitar. The voice that had made him a god now felt like it was betraying him in front of the world. He risked a glance sideways. Brian caught his eye, just for a heartbeat, and gave the smallest nod. Keep going. Don't stop. But Freddie felt exposed. It was like standing naked under floodlights. 72,000 eyes dissecting every tremor, every weakness. His throat was tight, muscles suddenly unreliable, the years of cigarette smoke and endless rehearsals clawing at his lungs. The audience stirred, unsure of how to react. Some fans cheered louder, desperate to drown out the mistake. Others looked at each other, confusion etched across their faces. A few simply stood, waiting to see if the magic was over. And Freddie felt that weight like a knife. He had never feared a stage before. Not Munich, not Rio, not Madison Square Garden. But tonight, under Wembley's sky, the silence after the crack was deafening. It pressed against him heavier than the amps, heavier than the noise. For the first time, Freddie Mercury wasn't sure he could finish the song. He adjusted his grip on the mic stand, knuckles whitening. He drew a deep breath, tried to summon the fire again, but it came with a tremor. His voice, when he pushed it out, felt raw, ragged, missing the smoothness that once flowed without thought. The crowd knew. He knew they knew. They'll remember this forever, he thought. The night Freddie Mercury cracked. The night I proved I wasn't invincible. It was a cruel irony. All his life, he had hidden behind larger-than-life masks, extravagant costumes, roaring performances, flamboyant gestures. He had convinced the world that Freddie Mercury was unbreakable. And yet, with one note, the illusion shattered. The crack wasn't just sound. It was the sound of mortality. The spotlight burned hotter. He felt the lenses of cameras swallowing him whole. Somewhere in the VIP box, executives shifted uncomfortably. On stage, John Deacon kept his head down, playing steady, pretending not to notice. Roger slammed the cymbals harder, filling the air with noise, trying to cover. But nothing could erase what had happened. For a long, dreadful beat, Freddie Mercury, the man who had turned stadiums into cathedrals, stood frozen, staring at the crowd, waiting for their verdict. Then, from the silence, came the first spark. A voice, just one, somewhere in the middle rows. A fan picked up the line Freddie had lost, singing it back into the night. A second voice joined, then a third, and suddenly the sound multiplied. Rows of people, sections of the stadium, voices colliding into a chorus. By the dozens, by the hundreds, by the thousands, the crowd was singing for him. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to support the channel. The first voice that rose from the crowd was thin, almost lost in the cavernous space of Wembley. Freddie heard it through the ringing in his ears, through the pounding of his own heart. A single voice, daring, shaky but determined, repeating the line he couldn't finish. Another joined, then another. It was like sparks leaping to dry kindling. In seconds, the scattered voices grew into dozens and hundreds, until entire sections of the audience were singing in unison, taking over the melody Freddie had dropped. At first, he thought he was hallucinating. His throat was still raw, his mind racing. The instinct to keep performing, to keep control, fought against the surge of sound rising from the audience. He tightened his grip on the microphone, the cool metal slick against his sweating palm. But he couldn't bring himself to sing over them. Instead, he just listened. The sound was raw, uneven, imperfect, and yet it was magnificent. Tens of thousands of voices, not polished or trained, but fierce, full of devotion. They weren't covering for him. They weren't mocking him. They were saving him. Still, doubt gnawed at him. Was this mercy or pity? Were they trying to rescue a collapsing idol? To keep his myth alive? Freddie's stomach clenched. To him, pity was worse than silence. He stepped back from the microphone, his boots sliding slightly against the slick platform. The movement was almost involuntary, like retreating from a flame too hot to endure. He looked sideways again. Brian May was bent over his guitar, hair cascading like a halo under the lights, but his eyes flicked up. A faint smile tugged at his lips as if to say, "Do you see it, Freddie? Do you feel what's happening?" Roger Taylor was pounding harder, cymbals clashing like thunder, keeping the spine of the moment alive. John Deacon's bass hummed steady and unshakable, grounding the chaos. They weren't panicking. They weren't worried. They trusted him to find his way back. Freddie wanted to trust himself, but the crack echoed like a ghost. It looped in his memory, cruel and unforgiving, each replay stabbing deeper. He thought of every cigarette he'd lit in backstage dressing rooms, every whiskey he downed after a show, every night he'd stayed up too late chasing melodies instead of sleep. All of it had carried him here, glorious highs, but now maybe the start of an irreversible fall. Was this what aging sounded like? Was this the beginning of the end? A knot formed in his chest, part fear, part shame. He could almost hear the tabloids. Mercury's magic gone? He could see the headlines in tomorrow's papers, the sneering reviews, the whispers in record label corridors. The myth undone, the king toppled not by scandal or excess, but by his own faltering voice. And yet, the crowd was still singing. He looked out, really looked this time. 72,000 faces tilted toward him, mouths wide, hands raised, eyes blazing with something he couldn't name. Not scorn, not pity, something fiercer. It hit him then. They weren't singing because he failed. They were singing because he mattered. The realization lodged in his throat, more powerful than the crack had been. For years, Freddie had believed his strength lay in control. He was a ringmaster, the lightning bolt, the untouchable god strutting across the stage. The audience followed him because he led them. But here, in this stumble, in this fracture, they weren't following. They were carrying him. Still, he hesitated. Doubt was a cruel master, and it whispered with venom. If you try again, you'll crack worse. If you open your mouth, they'll hear how fragile you become. Stay silent. Hide. His chest tightened. His breath came uneven, jagged, as though he were running out of air under the open sky. He turned slightly, catching a reflection in the glossy black piano set off to the side. His own face stared back at him, eyes wide, mouth slack, a man who looked terrified, not triumphant. This wasn't how legends were supposed to look. He clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to storm off stage. For the briefest flicker, he imagined it, walking out mid-song, disappearing into the dark. The band would cover. The papers would call it a meltdown. Maybe they'd even forgive him eventually. But then, another sound cut through. The crowd wasn't just singing now. They were shouting his name. Thousands of voices, ragged and relentless. Freddie, Freddie, Freddie. It rolled like thunder, louder than the amplifiers, louder than the band. The chant climbed up his spine, filling the hollow parts of him that the crack had carved out. His hands shook. He closed his eyes. And for the first time since the note had broken, a shiver ran down his arms. Not of fear, but of something dangerously close to awe. He opened his eyes again. In the blur of lights and bodies, he saw them. Fans on shoulders, arms linked in rows, faces streaming with tears. Some looked like they'd saved for years to be here. Others like they had traveled across oceans. People of every color, every age, all bound by this one night, this one voice. Even when that voice faltered, it wasn't pity. It was devotion. Freddie's throat tightened again, but this time it wasn't from weakness. He felt something swelling in him, pushing past the shame, pushing past the doubt. He realized this wasn't just his moment. It was theirs. The crack had broken the barrier between God and audience. For the first time in years, Freddie Mercury wasn't above them. He was with them. His fingers flexed around the mic stand. He lifted it slowly, deliberately, like raising a sword after nearly dropping it. His chest filled, not with fear now, but with a reckless sort of defiance. He hadn't yet decided whether he would sing again, but he knew one thing. He couldn't let this moment slip away. He leaned into the microphone, lips brushing the silver mesh, and whispered so low it was almost lost in the roar. "Sing it, my darlings. Sing it for me." And they did. The voices surged higher, stronger, filling Wembley with a wall of sound so immense it felt like the stadium itself might split apart. Roger's drum softened, Brian's guitar bent into harmony, and John's bass throbbed like a heartbeat. The band was no longer leading. They were following the crowd. Freddie stood in the center, trembling, his heart hammering with a cocktail of fear, gratitude, and something he hadn't felt in years, humility. For once, the stage didn't feel like a throne. It felt like an altar. The chant of his name still reverberated when the voices transformed. What began as chaos became order, as if some unseen conductor raised a baton over the stadium. The crowd's roar melted back in the melody of Somebody to Love, swelling with a force no amplification could match. 72,000 voices sang, imperfect but immense, raw but radiant. The stadium itself seemed to vibrate, concrete walls trembling as if holding back a tidal wave. Freddie Mercury, the man who had made entire continents bend to his will, stood frozen, clutching his mic stand like a lifeline, and he let them sing. He stepped back, boots scraping against the stage, and simply listened. His breath came shallow, his chest rising and falling in disbelief. Every instinct he'd built as a performer screamed at him to take control, to lead, to dominate. But tonight, in this moment, he wasn't a leader. He was a witness. Brian May leaned into his guitar, coaxing out chords like gentle waves to cradle the voices of the crowd. Roger Taylor's drumming softened, filling space without drowning it. John Deacon kept the bass steady, heartbeat-like, as if anchoring the chaos into something almost holy. Freddie closed his eyes. The sound surrounded him, wrapped him, pierced him. It wasn't polished like the choir of a cathedral, but it was bigger, purer. This was a human voice stripped bare, thousands of throats open, pouring out devotion in place of perfection. It was transcendent. His fingers trembled against the cold shaft of the mic stand. The crack that had shattered him minutes earlier now seemed distant, almost irrelevant. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about them. The people who had followed him for years, who had found themselves in his music, were now giving it back, unbroken. He opened his eyes, scanning the sea of faces. In the front rows, a girl barely 16 belted the lyrics with her fists raised high, mascara streaking down her cheeks. A middle-aged man in a suit, his tie loose and eyes shut tight, sang as if his life depended on it. A group of friends on someone's shoulders swayed together, arms locked, screaming the chorus to the sky. Freddie's heart lurched. They weren't just singing a song. They were confessing, rejoicing, demanding. It was as if the crowd had absorbed his crack, his flaw, and turned it into their own liberation. He felt the first goosebumps rise on his arms. And then it hit him with clarity, so sharp it almost knocked him backward. The power was never just his. For years, he had strutted across stages believing he was a conductor of storms, the wielder of thunder. But looking out now, he realized he had always been more than that. He had been a mirror. His voice had unlocked theirs. His courage had given them permission to scream, to cry, to break free. Tonight, they weren't just fans. They were the band, the choir, the force. He swallowed hard, tears burning behind his eyes. The band looked to him. Brian's guitar hovered, waiting. Roger's sticks tapped softly, poised. John's bass pulsed steady, patient. The question was in their eyes. Do you take it back now, Freddie? Or do you let it go? Freddie lifted the microphone slowly, deliberately, like he was raising a chalice. The crowd roared in anticipation, but he didn't silence them. Not yet. He leaned forward, his lips brushing the mesh, and sang, not to overpower, but to join. His voice cracked again, faintly on the first word. For a breath, his chest seized, but the crowd didn't care. They roared louder, swallowing the imperfection, weaving it into their own sound. Freddie laughed, an unrestrained, trembling laugh that broke through the tension like sunlight. He tilted his head back, teeth flashing under the lights, and kept singing. This time, the imperfection was his weapon. Every rasp, every tremor, every hint of fragility became a spark the audience caught and magnified. Together, they filled the night. The music was no longer performance. It was communion. The sound rose higher, shaking the sky itself. Planes passing overhead must have heard it. The echoes spilled into the streets beyond Wembley, carried down alleys, out windows, into the hearts of those who couldn't even get inside. Freddie's pulse pounded, blood rushing like fire through his veins. He felt alive in a way perfection had never given him. His body trembled, but it wasn't weakness. It was awe. The crowd had torn away the mask, and beneath it, he had found something bigger than himself. He glanced down at the stage floor, black with scuffs and scratches, remembering the thousands of times he had stood on stages like this, feeding on the adoration, commanding it like a monarch. But tonight, there was no crown, no throne. Tonight, he was standing shoulder to shoulder with 72,000 voices. His voice soared again, rough but resolute, and the crowd surged with him, matching him note for note, like waves chasing the moon. And Freddie Mercury, the man who had built his legacy on perfection, let himself be imperfect. He let himself be human. The result was more powerful than any flawless performance could have been. It was bigger than control, bigger than ego. It was unity. As the chorus thundered on, Freddie gripped the mic stand with both hands, knuckles white, eyes wet. He felt the cold metal vibrate with the roar of the speakers. But beneath that, he felt something more, an invisible current flowing from him to them and back again, a loop of energy that made the air itself hum. He shivered. Actual chills climbed his arms, raced across his shoulders, down his spine. The kind of chills no spotlight or stagecraft could manufacture. And in that electric second, he knew this crack, this failure would not end him. It would define him. Because tonight, the crowd wasn't just watching history. They were making it with him. The song wasn't Freddie's anymore. It belonged to the stadium, to the 72,000 voices roaring back at him with devotion fierce enough to split the night sky. And yet, he didn't feel diminished. He felt enlarged, as though the crowd's energy had fused with his own blood, coursing through every nerve. He leaned into the mic again, not to reclaim control, but to join the tide. His voice came raw, trembling at the edges, but the crowd met him at every word, lifting him higher than his own lungs ever could. The imperfection wasn't hidden. It was embraced. He could feel his throat straining, hear the gravel in his tone, but it didn't matter. The audience didn't want perfect Freddie Mercury. They wanted human Freddie, the one bleeding and singing and fighting through cracks. And so he gave them everything. Somebody, his voice cracked again, jagged, human, to love. The crowd roared, stronger, louder. The exchange became a dance. He didn't sing at them anymore. He sang with them, volleying lines back and forth, a call and response lifted straight out of gospel, magnified into a stadium hymn. Brian may lean closer, fingers flying across the guitar strings, smiling through his hair as if he'd been waiting his whole career for a moment like this. Roger Taylor slammed the snare, punctuating the choir with thunder. John Deacon's bass rumbled steady beneath it all, like a heart refusing to falter. Freddie straightened, lifting the half-mic stand above his head, twirling it like a flag. The crowd erupted, a wall of sound so immense it nearly drowned the band's instruments. His eyes blazed, sweat pouring, teeth flashing in a grin that was half defiance, half reverence. The crack that had shamed him minutes ago was gone. Not forgotten, but transformed. What had been a stumble now became a symbol. He realized it with startling clarity. They weren't worshiping him because he was flawless. They were worshiping him because he dared to break and still stand. The press pit, once frantic with scribbling pens, now stood slack-jawed. One reporter, notebook forgotten, mouthed the lyrics with the crowd. Another dropped his camera for a moment, overcome by the sheer force of what he was witnessing. The scandal they'd been hungry for had dissolved into legend before their eyes. And Freddie, he laughed. Not the polished stage laugh he gave to charm the crowd, but a guttural, unguarded laugh that shook his whole body. He bent forward, resting his hands on his knees, gasping with joy and exhaustion, then threw his head back and bellowed into the night. "Sing it louder, my darlings." They obeyed instantly, a tidal surge that rattled the floodlights. The stadium had become a cathedral, the audience a choir, and Freddie Mercury their preacher. Not a perfection, but a passion. He straightened, lifted the mic, and pushed his voice harder, rough edges and all. The band kicked harder behind him, following his lead as he rose into the storm. His throat burned, every note scraped raw, but it didn't matter. His soul was louder than his vocal cords. He stomped across the stage, boots striking like hammers, every stride defiant. He pointed into the sea of faces, eyes blazing. A girl fainted in the front row, overwhelmed by the sheer electricity of his presence. A boy on his father's shoulders reached his hands toward him as if trying to touch the sun. The chant came again, not from him, but from them. "Freddie, Freddie, Freddie." He felt it pierce him, not as an ego stroke, but as communion. He wasn't just their idol. He was their voice, cracked and imperfect, but still roaring. Brian hit a guitar break, the notes sharp as lightning bolts, and Freddie seized the moment. He dropped to his knees at the edge of the stage, arms flung wide, face lifted to the sky. The roar cascaded over him, a baptism of sound. He whispered to himself, barely audible even to his own ears, "This is it. This is what I was born for." And the chills came. They raced up his arms, spread across his chest, down to his fingertips. His skin prickled, alive with energy. He had felt adoration before, applause, ovations that lasted minutes. But nothing like this. This was beyond music, beyond performance. This was survival turned to glory, a crowd choosing to lift him higher when he thought he had fallen. The chorus neared its end. Freddie's throat burned with every word, but he didn't hold back. His voice cracked once more on the final climb, but now it sounded like victory, like defiance, like truth. The band hit the final notes, cymbals crashing, guitars wailing. Freddie staggered to his feet, chest heaving, arms raised high above his head, sweat dripping down his temples like holy water. He didn't need to sing the last line. The crowd sang it for him. 72,000 voices slamming the night with a force that shook his very bones. And when it ended, when the last note faded into the air, the silence that followed was deafening, sacred. For one beat, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Then the ovation hit. It wasn't applause, it was an earthquake. Stomping, screaming, clapping, weeping, chanting. Wembley shook to its foundations. The lights themselves seemed to flicker in awe. Freddie Mercury, once afraid he had lost them, now stood at the center of a storm he could never have conjured on his own. He lowered the mic stand slowly, deliberately, like setting down a weapon after battle. His chest rose and fell, his eyes glassy. He whispered into the mesh, almost too soft to hear, "Thank you." And the roar only grew louder. The man who had cracked was the man they loved most. The myth of perfection was gone, but the legend had just been born. The ovation was still rolling like thunder, crashing in wave after wave. Long after the final note had died, Freddie Mercury stood motionless at the center of the stage, chest heaving, arms still stretched wide, as though he were trying to hold all 72,000 voices in his embrace. The lights glared down, hot and merciless, yet the sweat dripping from his skin felt cool, almost icy. Goosebumps prickled every inch of his body. The roar from the crowd wasn't just sound. It was physical, slamming into him, vibrating through his bones, rattling his teeth, filling his lungs. For the first time in his career, Freddie didn't feel like he was giving to the audience. He felt like he was receiving. He let the mic fall to his side, dangling loosely, useless now. They didn't need him to sing anymore. They had become the music. All he could do was stand in awe, a man humble before his own creation. He turned slowly, scanning the ocean of faces lit by floodlights and camera flashes. The stadium was a mosaic of humanity. Tears, laughter, fists raised, arms linked. Every single person seemed to be vibrating with the same energy that shook his soul. Brian May stepped toward him, guitar still slung over his shoulder, his expression soft, almost reverent. Roger Taylor twirled a drumstick and pointed it toward the crowd like a salute. John Deacon gave one of his quiet smiles, steady as ever. They all knew they weren't just musicians tonight. They were witnesses. Freddie pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the wild hammer of his heart. He mouthed a single word to the crowd, "Beautiful," and they answered with another roar, so fierce it nearly knocked him backward. His throat ached, scraped raw from the cracks, but he couldn't resist anymore. He raised the mic again, not to sing, but to lead them. He held it high above his head, then lowered it toward the crowd, beckoning. The response was immediate. The entire stadium thundered the chorus again, unaccompanied, tens of thousands of voices locked in unison. It was no longer Queen performing for an audience. It was 72,000 people performing with Queen. Freddie laughed, eyes glistening, his shoulders shaking with the force of it. He tilted the mic back to himself and let out a final, broken note, raspy, imperfect, but glorious. The crowd exploded, their roar doubling, as if they had been waiting for him to put the final stamp on their communion. The chills surged again, stronger, racing across his body until he trembled. His skin felt electrified, every hair standing on end. He had performed in Rio before 500,000, in Tokyo before seas of faces, but nothing, not one show, had ever felt like this, because tonight he hadn't been untouchable. Tonight he had been fragile, and they had loved him not despite it, but because of it. The realization lodged deep in his soul, a truth he hadn't dared to believe until this moment. Perfection had never been the source of his power. Connection was. The crack in his voice had cracked something open in them too, and together they had poured into that opening with a force greater than any song. He lowered the mic again, breathing hard, unable to stop smiling. His grin was wide, boyish, almost shy. For once, he wasn't Freddie Mercury, the untouchable icon. He was just Freddie, grateful, trembling, human. And yet, in that humanity, he had never felt more like a legend. The ovation wouldn't end. People stomped their feet, so hard the ground shook. Fans cried openly, clutching each other. Chants of "Freddie, Freddie," rippled through the night air unstoppable. He stood there, frozen, letting it wash over him, a baptism in sound and love. His arms dropped to his sides. His eyes glistened with tears he refused to wipe away. He wanted them to see him, every crack, every flaw, every ounce of truth. Then slowly he lifted the mic once more, but this time he didn't sing. He whispered, his voice hoarse, barely audible even through the amplification. You've given me chills. And somehow, impossibly, the crowd grew louder. The sound was deafening now. Not applause but affirmation, not noise but love. It was as if the universe itself had conspired to say, "You are ours, and we are yours." Brian hit a triumphant chord. Roger crashed the cymbals, and John thumped the bass like a heartbeat one last time. Freddie raised both arms to the sky, eyes closed, mouth open in a grin that bordered on ecstasy. For those few seconds, he wasn't just performing. He was immortal. The moment would outlive him. Long after the sweat dried, long after the lights dimmed, long after his voice was silenced by time, this night would remain. The crack would not be remembered as a failure. It would be remembered as a spark that ignited 72,000 souls into a single legendary flame. As the ovation thundered on, Freddie whispered one last word into the microphone, so soft it nearly vanished under the roar. Forever. And in that instant, everyone believed it. If you like this story, please subscribe to support this channel.